Okay, this is Chapter 3, Lecture Part 2. I'd finished off with some of the social classes of Nubia and Egypt. Another good indication of someone's social status was their grave. The wealthy in Egypt, they would be mummified, and they would have tombs, or even in the case of the pharaoh's pyramids, to house their bodies. In early Egypt, there was no mummification. In most of Egypt's history, there was no mummification for the poor people. In the earliest times of Egypt, only the pharaoh himself was mummified. And in fact, as far as religion, well, I'll wait till religion comes. In Egypt, women, although it was very, very rare for women to rule, there were often cases of women regents who would rule for their young sons, sons who were the pharaoh, but they were 5, 10, 12 years old, not really old enough to make grown-up decisions. Women would rule in their stead. We'll talk about WHAP Ch, who is a very notable exception to the rule of women. Women's jobs in Egypt and Nubia were to be head of the household. The wealthy women, they would oversee their servants. Basically, they were managers. They made sure that somebody was dusting, somebody was cleaning, and taking care of the children. So they were in a managerial position there. Also, women wielded great power as priestesses in the various Egyptian cults that existed. These women would, they had that mystery about them, and they had a lot of people cult following them. As far as economics go, use of the wheel and the sail allowed trade to be incredibly profitable for the Egyptians especially, but also for the Nubians. It took the Nile societies, both Nubia and Egypt, a while to adopt the metallurgy. They were 1,500 years behind bronze technology of the Mesopotamians. Again, they were using wooden weapons and stone weapons for a long time after the Mesopotamians were actually using bronze. Bronze was incredibly expensive. You'll see this is always the case. Bronze was rare because you had to have tin and copper. Egypt was not tin and copper rich. So bronze itself was very expensive, and only the wealthy really could afford it. The most prized export of Egypt was its textiles, that's clothing. Maybe you've heard the term Egyptian cotton. But anyway, textiles was something that the Egyptians liked to trade. They imported leopard skins, gems from southern Africa, slaves from southern Africa, and so in some cases finished products from Mesopotamia. There was definitely a good trade link between the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians as time went on after about 3500 BCE. As far as writing went, the Egyptians had a form of writing probably based off of cuneiform of the Sumerians. It was pictographic, and you've heard of it. It's hieroglyphics. You've all seen it somewhere in your life because we know the Egyptians pretty well. Hieroglyphics, they would be chiseled into the stone, into the pyramids, into the temples, but Egyptians also wrote on something called papyrus. What this was a reed that was found along the Nile River. You would take the reed out, and they would do this cross-hatching technique, which would create something kind of like paper that they could write on. And we've actually found papyrus scrolls today. We have basically paper that has lasted that long, so it's pretty impressive. The Nubians, and the Egyptians would actually eventually, while hieroglyphics looked pretty, it was kind of cumbersome to write, and so they would write in hieroglyphics, speak in a different language, and eventually later on down the line they would change their written language to something called Coptic, which was a little easier to wield, and then even after that they would replace and adopt the Greek alphabet, what we talked about in the first chapter, or the last chapter, chapter 2. The Nubians themselves, they had their own spoken languages, but they wrote with Egyptian hieroglyphics as well. Both these societies had very much organized religion. In fact, Egypt is a theocracy, meaning that they were run by religion, because the head of their state, the pharaoh, was a god. So it's religious in aspect, so it's a theocracy. Nubians tended to have their own sets of gods, although they did adopt a couple of the Egyptian spirits and kind of assimilated them into Nubian culture. The Nubians borrowed more from the Egyptians than the Egyptians borrowed from the Nubians. There were many cults. The two main gods of the Egyptians, and the Egyptians had thousands of gods, colorful gods. The two most important were Amon and Re, who basically were both sun gods. sun gods tend to be the most important gods in all these societies because the sun and water are what grows crops. So they tend to hold very significant positions in these societies. There was a short period when Egypt changed to a monotheistic religion. Amenhotep IV, he believed in one god, Aten, and while he was there, he tried to erase all the other gods that the Egyptians had worshipped. But once he died, the Egyptians tried to act like he had never been pharaoh before. They got rid of all his stuff and went back to worshiping how they had always worshipped. Pyramids were important for religion. You had the mummification and everything going on. Nubians built pyramids as well, but on much smaller scales. But Nubians never mummified. That was something they never did. Lastly, the Bantu. That's the most important thing going on in sub-Saharan Africa. We know a lot more about the part of Africa north of the Sahara than we do the southern part, the interior of Africa. The Bantu migrations, these were people that were agricultural in nature, and because of that, they had huge populations. And once those populations got too big and unwieldy, people wanted more space, and so they left. These migrations were not mass migrations that happened overnight. They were gradual migrations that happened every so many years. But increasingly, as time went on, more and more of these migrations would occur. The Bantu peoples would constantly, as they're going into the interior of Africa, which is tropical rainforest in the interior, they came across a people known as the forest peoples. You may know them as the Pygmies. They're no longer called the Pygmies. They were called the forest peoples. But these two traded with each other, but there were some clashes over land because the Bantu's population was exploding. Hunter-gatherers don't support a big population because they never quite have enough food. The Bantu, their populations exploded, and so they really overran a lot of the forest peoples. Languages-wise, for the Bantu, you're talking about a people as they spread, languages developed from the Congo-Niger mother group language that the Bantu borrowed from. Eventually, over time, you would have 500 different distinct Bantu languages being spoken throughout southern Africa and coastal Africa. As far as religion went, Sudanic and Bantu peoples actually believed in monotheism well before the Egyptians and before even the Mesopotamians. As far back as 5000 BCE, so 7,000 years ago, the Bantu and the Sudanic peoples were thinking about supreme universal gods. As far as the big picture goes, and one more thing, to talk to those gods, you had to have an intermediary, meaning that you couldn't just talk to those gods directly as a person. There was someone else, they used dead ancestors, so they would have these ancestor spirits, and they would talk to the ancestor spirits and say, please talk to the god on my behalf. That was something that's fairly commonplace, and you'll see that there's some similarities with that in China when we talk about China. As far as the big picture goes, agriculture is the key for all societies. An organization which leads to specialized labor is another key. You have people who all they do is trade. They're merchants. There are people who are artisans who create pottery, rugs. You have people running the show, the bureaucracy. You have the people doing the hard labor, the peasants and the slaves. All these things are byproducts of complex societies. Priestly classes, especially in Egypt. The priest class is very important. It's well towards the top of the social pyramid. Trade made everything better. The Nile made trade possible, made it easier for the Egyptians. They traded with sub-Saharan Africa, and they traded with Mesopotamia. And both the Nubians and the Egyptians were patriarchal societies where men dominated, which is fairly the norm in ancient history and even not so ancient history. Although out of the two, and compared to the Mesopotamians, women actually had more power in Egypt. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you in chapter 4.